Welcome to episode 48 of Out of Bounds, a podcast where I give my social commentary on different topics in today's society. I'm your host, Terry, and today we're talking about the N-word, my journey with it. I mean, we've talked about my journey with a number of things, and I do think journey is appropriate. There's things that you start out with. There's things that you change your mind when you learn new information. There's a lot of negotiation about the impact and, how you go about using the word, how you want others to use it. And so there's a lot to unpack. It's a very loaded conversation, but one that I think doesn't have to be so loaded all the time. I would say from a very early age, I felt that the word didn't have as much or shouldn't have as much influence as people made it out to be. I think in 2019 particular, our society is very hung up on historical context. And context is always important, but I don't think knowing the context is the same as letting it dictate what you think or do. And so for me, I understand the context of the N-word and I understand how it was used and all that, but that to me doesn't mean a whole lot because it's historical, it's history. So the way they used it in one era isn't the same as now. And it also doesn't tell you how you should feel about it. And so for me, I just kind of, I think like most people, if you grew up around it, then you kind of adopted it into your language, but it didn't mean the same connotation that it did in the past. And so I think specifically one of the most clear times that I remember engaging with the topic was junior year of high school. We were reading Huckleberry Finn, I believe, and the word is used in that book. And so the whole week before we read the book, and we went to class every other day, much like college. So this was only 3 times we met, but 3 times we spent class talking about this before we read the book to prepare us. So, it was a humanities honors class. I was always in the honors cohort, and so there wasn't a lot of African-American people. And so it was a few voices that were stronger than others. And that's how it goes. But for me, I remember like when the question was posed, it was like, okay, let me think about how I felt. And I remember there was another student in there, and he was talking about his auntie or grandma, one of the two, and kind of like how he was just so opposed against the word because of what she taught him and what she went through. And I understand that. Again, it's all about what's taught to us. That's our native knowledge. And so for me, I didn't have that same teaching about the word. And so I didn't feel as strongly. But even from what my parents and family said about it, I still made my own thought. And my own thought was, again, people give power to words. That was the first time I realized that. People give power to words. I always say this. I might have said it in other episodes, but I love saying it. If you're a 90s baby and you watch the show Recess on Disney, one of my favorite shows ever. But Disney, Recess, there was an episode where TJ, the main character, he made up a word and he was using the word. And so it was completely made up. But since Miss Finster, the assistant principal or whatever she was, and the teachers didn't know what it meant, they ended up giving him detention. He's like, what I get detention for? And he was like, for using that word. And he was like, basically like, do you even know what it means? So it's like, we don't know what it means, so we assume it's negative. And that's a whole nother lesson. But in the lesson also is people give power to words. A word is just something to sound. And when people give context and add to it, then you give it power. So much like we are in 2019 with a lot of people, is like, GA versus a hard ER. is different, and it's okay to use it here and that. People negotiate and socially construct when it's okay. We negotiate, the power of the word. And so that to me was a big lesson at that time in high school, where it's like, we give power to word. If we continue to cringe or to jump down people's throat or to act like it's crazy when someone says it, then it's going to continue to have that type of power. And I think because that was maybe 2007 till now, I think that has come to fruition where it's like the whole idea of claiming back a word. But the problem is when you claim back a word, that other people start to think it's okay. And so it's like everybody's looking at you like, look, I didn't say the ER, I said the GA. And so like, that's cool. That's in music. That's what y'all say. And so we don't have the same negative power. And so that's where it gets very confusing, because you did take the negative power away from the word, but then you try to give the negative power back when somebody doesn't look like you says it. And so that was my whole thing. That was the first time I struggled with it. And I was very clear with it. I was like, to me, and I think most of the time, even at a young age, I've been very contrarian. And so I love pointing out the hypocrisy of people. And so I would use it just because people didn't want you to use it. And so I was kind of like that as a youngster. But I think in college, or I know in college, going to a predominantly white institute, I was challenged in a very different way about using the word. Because at the time, I was just like, I don't care. And so in college, that's when I kind of realized I did care. And it was different because, the socioeconomic background matters, and that's big to me. And so I've talked before about black and white as culture, not as ethnicity and race, because it's mostly about culture when we talk about it. The people that I went to school with, that lived in the same area I lived in, that had some of the struggles I had, when they said it to me, it was different. But then when I went to college and it was people that wasn't from where I'm from, clearly wasn't in the same lifestyle that I was from, and they would use it, it was different. And so that's when I started to realize that, no, it did bother me in some context. And then, I think I went through a lot of the phases. I went through the phases where it was like, if you're not black, don't say it. I went through the phase where nobody should say it. I went through a lot of the different phases. And so I would say even now, as I'm getting ready to turn 30, I'm still negotiating what I feel about it. But I do return to that idea that people give power to words. And so I still feel like when we have these controversies and everything, and it's like, well, this person's not black or this person's not that, everybody has their exceptions. And I go back to what I feel with culture. And so, I've heard people say, and I'll give a shout out, that's fine, Kev on Stage Studios / Kev on Stage. I watch a lot of his stuff, and they recently had a conversation about who can say the N word, which kind of sparked this because of Gina Rodriguez and all that. But even in there, you had somebody make my perfect example where they talked about this guy that they grew up with who is Caucasian. And he's like, he could say it, but, he can only say it around me. And that's because I know where he's coming from. Whereas other people might not know where he's coming from. And any other Caucasian people, I don't know where they're coming from. My point is about culture. It's not about skin color. And when you have people that are in the culture, you can be in the culture even though you don't have the same skin color. And so that was kind of proving my point. But at the end of the day, it's a word. And you give power. And I don't mean people as in as a society. As a society, we give power. But even as an individual, you give power. There's things that you could call me that might upset me more. There's things that you call me that wouldn't upset me that might upset somebody else. It's about the power you give to it. And I don't give a lot of power to it because at the end of the day, and I do think it's appropriate to say, like, nigger is a term that was used in a specific time for a specific reason. When you're talking about dehumanizing people, when you're talking about making them feel less than, feeling other, like animals and, anything like that. And it's different because it's even different. Like I think about the 40s and 50s, where it's like we were segregated, but people liked us. They liked us to entertain. They didn't like us enough to marry us or be around us and eat with us, but they liked our style. They were like, man, we're entertained by them. And then you move to 2019 where things aren't equal, but they love our, cool, for lack of a better term. They want us to set the cool marker. But I could go to the same bathroom. I could go to a university. I could get a degree. I could, be paid the same. And it is things that aren't equal, but we're not at all where we were in the 50s. And even in the 50s, it was still a different thing because they liked us. You're talking about slave times when the word was created, derived from Latin and all that. It was to dehumanize. It was like, don't touch anything around me. Don't be around me. We don't want to hear your songs. They weren't sitting in our church. Like, they didn't want to hear any of that. It was like, you are a different species of thing. And to me, we're so far removed from that. And people get upset and offended. And it's like, you didn't live that life. You didn't even come close to living that life. We've all had discrimination, racism. We've gone through trauma. But you didn't come close to what the word was intended for. So to me, it holds no power. It not even close to the power for what it was intended. And so if you say that to me, honestly, I mean 1,000%. It could be Trump, Pence. It could be anybody come up to my face and be like, call me that nigger. And it's just like, okay. Whatever. What does that mean? I mean, we've had so many examples. I think about School Days from Spike Lee with the local yokel scene. I did a paper on that, but like he was just like, "You're not niggas. You're not niggers," and it's like that statement is powerful. And then I think about other things where even Dave Chappelle recently, like he was saying like, I'm not a nigger and all these different things. And it's just like, it's so important for people to realize that that is a very different term. That's a very different idea. And while there are 100% racist, there's people like that. It's not the same as it was. So I don't get offended by it. Now, as far as who can use it and how we use it and all that, it's difficult. And as I said, I'm still negotiating. For me, I still use it. I use it with my friends and stuff. GA, not ER. But I don't really think there's a major difference, to be honest. Like the whole claiming back a term, I don't really believe much in that. So it's not a big difference to me, but I use GA, not ER. And it's mostly with my friends. I love the jokes and all that, the music. But I don't know, it's tough because I'll say when I first left college, and I guess this is the third time, I went to Chicago public schools and I was at a school that was over 80% Latino. And all the Puerto Rican, Mexican, Latino people was calling each other that. And my first reaction again out of college was like, no, hell no, y'all don't get to say that. And not even that you don't get to say it to protect power, but also, why would you want to say that? Find something else. It's much like cursing. I don't curse. Never curse. Parents taught me not to curse. And one of the biggest reasons I've been able to stick to that, I think, is because early on my dad was like, expand your vocabulary. There's so many other words. And I was like, that's true. And that's helped me. And I feel the same with the N-words. It's like, Look, why are y'all calling each other that? There's other things y'all can do. There's other things from your culture, and there's just other vocabulary you can use. And so, I didn't fix everybody, but I was very much about calling people out. Don't say that around me. And don't say that around me doesn't help, because it makes people want to do it more. And it means they'll just do it when you're not around. So I realized that it was a losing battle. But in Chicago, I realized a lot of Latinos use it. And it still wears me out to this day. And I feel similar where I'm like, just find something else to say. But I don't fight it a lot. I really don't. It still makes me uncomfortable, but I don't fight it a lot. And so, yeah, man, I do think I think the word is different now, but not because of the GA and ER. I think it's just the power that people gave it. And so, we as people start to talk about, setting the standard and being cool. And it's just in our music. And that's kind of what we shown to a lot of people is cool. But I go back to the socioeconomic things. Like, I'm very, it's very hard to offend me. But if, again, somebody I grew up with, where I grew up, came up to me and said it, or if somebody I didn't even know grew up where I grew up and they came up to me and said that they was Caucasian, like, what up, my nigga? But somebody that is, from Evanston or, a rich neighborhood, suburb of Chicago came up and they African American, but clearly have been from privileged culture, and they said it to me, I might be more offended that they said it. And I'm not going to get mad, but I'm going to be more offended. And so, it's tough. It's tough. And I think this kind of proves it. I don't have an answer yet. I do like it still to push to provoke and to be provocative and push the narrative against people that try to use the claim back as a way of like, yo, you say it, so we can say it. I do try to use that, but I also try to distinguish between culture of white and black and not just race. And I do use it as a form of solidarity, because there is that part of the claim back where you used it negatively for so long. Now we use it positively. But to be 100% honest, is more probably a product of my time period and when I grew up. I just wasn't close to that, and the family I grew up with wasn't close to that. And so the way we use it is just different. But there's a lot of ongoing conversation about who can and can't use it. If it was up to me, and I guess that's the question we ask ourselves, if it was up to me and like what I say was 100% law, I would say that it's hard for me to say nobody because I'm not a fan of censorship, but if it was up to me, it just would not be a part of the mainstream catalog or mainstream vocabulary. But if it was used, it would just be by people of African American descent. Rarely. Again, not mainstream catalog, but if it's being used, it would just be of people of African American descent out of respect. So that's kind of where I fall. So anyway, go to the comment section. There's a whole bunch, but tell me what you think, especially if you had your own journey with the N-word and negotiating. Tell me what you think. Share it around. Thumbs up, subscribe, and until next episode.